Hey everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Bleeding Metal. I am super excited to be here today. My name is Kiki, she, her, and I am here with my lovely co-host, of course.
My name is Pia, she, her, and welcome to our podcast.
And we have a guest today as well to talk to us about our favorite topic. So, first of all, let's introduce you, or please introduce yourself, Anna.
Sure. So I'm Dr. Anna S. Rogers, and I am a lecturer and sociologist at the University of Georgia.
That is so awesome. Your pronouns?
Yes.
My pronouns are she, her.
I love how you put your title in your name as well, because it is something really important, and that is to just dive right into the topic, right? All of these kind of academic achievements, I think it is. I don't know. I'm gonna say this, and it's gonna sound wrong, but I think it's kind of more usual or more natural to hear men say those kind of things, and so yeah, it's just really amazing to have women be proud of their achievements just as well.
Absolutely. So my mom actually, this a little bit of a backstory since we're talking about feminism today. Anyways, she actually got pregnant with me when she was a teenager, and she had a full ride to, full scholarship to go to college. And basically, her school kind of doubted whether or not she was actually going to be able to go to college while she had a baby. And she just showed everybody and went all the way through and got a PhD herself. And so she has always been huge on education. And once I got my doctorate, she was like, "You always introduce yourself as doctor,
Hell
since you've earned
yes.
that."
Shout out
Yeah.
Oh,
to
of
her.
course.
Yeah. Oh, she's a total badass and total feminist. I love her to death.
Great.
That is amazing. And yeah, with that, you also just introduced our topic for today. We're going to talk about feminism again, and I am super hyped about that. But before we start getting more into the nitty gritty of it, so to speak, I just wanted to do a short check-in with all of us together, because we are still going through a full-on pandemic. I have the news that I just got over COVID myself. I I don't know. I held strong for 2 whole years, and then it finally hit me. But I'm super super grateful and fortunate to have caught the milder version of it. Also because I was fully vaccinated. I'm still waiting for my third dose, but since I just got antibodies the other way, I don't know when that's gonna happen. But yeah, I'm very grateful to be healthy again. I just got my negative, and yes. So, how are you holding on through this whole global pandemic apocalypse thing?
So here in Georgia, actually, we are kind of operating under the idea that the pandemic is over, unfortunately. So they have me teaching fully face-to-face classes, full capacity of students, which is very stressful, and makes me very anxious. But I'm fully
Of course.
vaccinated. I was able to get my booster, and I've literally just like have hand sanitizer like on my keychain, in my backpack, even in my pocket. So I'm like sanitizing constantly.
All right. Lots of strength to you. That does seem like a stressful situation, but I mean, it also has a bit of a positive side to be, kind of close to humans again, and all of that jazz.
Yeah, it does kind of, feel you get a little bit more of that normalcy, even though you're using sanitizer all the time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What about you?
On Monday, I got my booster vaccination, and on Tuesday afternoon and on Wednesday, I got a really bad headache and didn't feel really well. But yeah, I'm happy that I now have the full protection against COVID finally and can take part of everyday life here in Germany again, because when you're not vaccinated or when you don't have your third vaccination, you have to get tested to get in most of activities that you can do over here. And so life is much easier when you have this booster. And anyways, I think everybody who can get this vaccine should get it, because there are people who can't get vaccinated. And yeah, for them, we should support them by getting vaccinated ourselves.
Absolutely.
Indeed. So let's now go into our topic for today. Your book launch is the premise of this amazingly wonderful meeting. Because, by the way, it's really nice to meet you.
You too. I'm so happy to be here today with y'all.
Thank you so much in advance for your time and for all the knowledge I'm sure we're gonna share today with each other. So, your book is called Doing Gender in Heavy Metal Perceptions on Women in a Hypermasculine Subculture. Can you tell us a little bit more about, I don't know, how did your research in this topic start? And yeah.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, my mom, she's a hardcore feminist. She was big into education. And while she was going to school, my dad took care of me as a kid, me and my little brother, and he was the manager of a record store. So I kind of grew up simultaneously being in a record store with my dad, talking about music constantly, and then also having kind of this feminist um, input from my mom. And I feel like I just naturally ended up here. My dad actually, he's more into like hair metal from the 80s, he was really big into like Bon Jovi and things like that. And so when I first started listening to metal as like a tiny little kid, it was more like the hair metal. And then, I got into Metallica and other things like that with my dad. And then as I got into high school, I went to a very, very rural school in the middle of nowhere. Most people listen to like country music. Pretty much that was it. And so, I was kind of the weird kid to an extent that listened to heavy metal at my school. And as I kind of got older and was able to like branch out and find bands that I myself liked, I got really heavily into new metal. And I know that like a lot of people are like, oh, like that's so cheesy. Like all the metal fans come at me for being a big new metal fan, but it is what it is. That's my favorite. So I got really big into the band Korn, specifically Korn and Slipknot, bands like that. And then I went into undergraduate, and I was in my third year, I think, of undergrad, and I was in a women's studies class. I have my undergraduate minor is in women's studies, and there was a book that we read that talked about, it was like women and culture, kind of in general in American society. And it mentioned that the reason that we saw the decline in the Lilith Fair and other popular like feminist music of the 90s was because of this new genre called new metal. And I was shocked because I had never seen an academic book talk about metal music. And so I was like super into it. But unfortunately, I kept reading, and essentially the book said that this new hypermasculine subgenre of rap and metal, the two most sexist, I'm using air quotes, the most sexist genres of music, led to a hypersexist genre and just kind of, destroyed anything that was happening with other genres of women's music at the time. And as a fan of new metal, I was like, this is just not right. Like, I know the lyrics to the song, I know like the things that they sing about. And, it's not sexist. That's not what they're saying. And so I was curious if I was biased as a fan, or if the people who had written that book just really had not taken the time to understand metal, and specifically new metal as a genre. And so when I transferred to the University of South Carolina, I knew that I wanted to, as soon as possible, do a research project and figure this out. I wanted to remain unbiased. I wanted to do it scientifically and figure out, was this true? So I was very, very lucky and fortunate and blessed to have come across my mentor, who is also the co-author of the book, Dr. Matthew DeFlem, who is also a huge fan of metal. He is like a walking encyclopedia of metal. He knows the history, he knows every band, the big bands, the small bands. He's gone to more concerts than anyone ever of all time, probably. And so I sat down with him and we just started having a conversation about metal music. And I told him about that book that I had read. And I said, I'd like to get started on research now. And, it's not very common here in the US for an undergraduate student to start doing research, before going into graduate school. But my university offered the opportunity to do a distinction thesis. And so I set out just to look at the lyrics. And so essentially the first project I did, I took kind of heavy metal in general as a genre. I took specifically new metal as a genre, and I compared the lyrical themes through a content analysis to rap, pop music and country music to see, is it true that metal, and specifically new metal, is more sexist than these other popular genres of music? And what I found is that the answer was no. And especially new metal actually tended to be the least sexist. It was still sexist. I found sexism in all five genres, but new metal was the least. And essentially, what that kind of sparked an interest for me was that country music. I grew up in the Southeast in America. That's like the wholesome music. So, like, if parents find out their kids are listening to country music, they think that that's great. There's no cursing and like things of that nature. And what I found in that content analysis is the songs were saying essentially the exact same things about women. It's just the way that they did it was different. So, obviously, heavy metal has the growling, the heavy guitar, the heavy drums. And if you look at rap music, also, I think that that's another genre that is unfairly portrayed as being sexist in a lot of cases. They're doing it, to the hip hop beats and things like that. So it doesn't sound like country music, but what they were saying was so, so similar. The only difference was that country music did it in what I call a subtle way. They did subtle sexism. So you wouldn't hear them, using the word bitch, for example, but they would talk about women, being in the kitchen barefoot, cooking a meal, having those babies, and things like that. And so what I basically ended up kind of uncovering was that women were being treated the same. It's just the way that it was being done was much more subtle, and some of these other more acceptable, air quotes, their genres. And so once I had done that, I knew for sure I wanted to stay within metal, specifically. And again, as a heavy metal fan myself, during that project and going out and, spending time reading all the literature on just heavy metal in general, what I found is that academics really had, historically, a really bad misconception about heavy metal in general. I was very concerned with the way the group was represented. And the worst thing to me was the way that mosh pits were represented. So the idea that these academic people were coming in who knew nothing about the subculture, nothing about the genre, and were basically saying this is violent, this is hyper masculine, this is, negative for society. They do this aggressive moshing where they're, openly fighting each other. And, I was like, if they had even gone to like one metal show, I think that they would have seen the error in what they were saying, that it just wasn't accurate. And so that led me to reflect on my own personal concert experiences as a woman, as a metal fan, also as a feminist, I should add. And so I wanted to go deeper into that. And so that's where my master's thesis idea came from, which is where the idea for the book originated. And basically, I wanted to see, how are women fans describing their experiences as being metal fans? And how does that compare to how men describe their experiences as being metal fans? And so I ended up asking the participants the same set of questions, divided into 10 men and to 10 women, and basically just compared what they were saying about the genre and about gender differences and behaviors at concerts. And so from there, I ended up doing a dissertation which didn't have to do with metal. It was actually on self-identified witches in the US, which, if you're interested in that, we could talk about that later. But then once that was finished, I wanted to come back to this heavy metal project because really that's my heart project. My passion was there. And so I talked with my mentor, Matthew DeFlem. I actually stayed and got all of my degrees at the same school just so I could keep working with him. He was that phenomenal of a mentor. And so he really helped me bolster. And we did some more research. He did a lot of additional research on the newer studies that had come out on heavy metal. And so together we took that original idea, and especially him, I have to give him so much credit. He turned it into a phenomenal book, and the book that you see today that just came out.
Yeah, awesome. I can
Amazing.
relate to so many things you just said, especially when you just read the lyrics of pop music. They're so sexist. So come on, it's most of the time worse.
Yeah, that is something I wanted to talk about as well. But I think such a thorough comparison is what the least people actually do so consciously, or are so aware of it. I think the whole prejudice, or the satanization of metal is
Yeah.
is actually
Absolutely.
it might have a lot to do with, the black wearing, the love for wearing black, and I don't know, lots of other things, probably the imagery of album or record covers and etc. But I think it might just be about courage, about uttering those words, or the form of expression of using that kind of thing, of these specific themes and topics and words, that might be it. I have no idea. You're probably more knowledgeable about it. But what you were saying, what you both were saying about the topics and in comparison with other genres is just triggered in my mind this thing of or this other comparison. Right now, I am in Ecuador, as everybody knows. I come from here, and I have obviously been listening to different music than when I'm in my other habitat in Germany. Obviously, I listen to metal all the time, but here I do go out, well, before the pandemic started being so bad again. So in November, for example, I still went out, and there's a lot of reggaeton here, for example, which is very sexual, actually. Because of that, it has actually it also has this kind of very bad reputation. But lots of the songs, especially the newer songs by feminist women and musicians producing this kind of music, are actually very empowering. And even the earlier or some of the earlier songs were, which actually involved women, they were kind of feminist and empowering. And compared to the genres with a better reputation, this whole lot of super cheesy Spanish romantic music, the super cheesy pop ballads and all of that romanticize love in such a sexist way that is just so
Absolutely.
infuriating. Why? How can that be more acceptable? And I think it just, of course, in the context of a Latin American society that is very conservative, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, it's just, I don't think we are used to analyzing this deeply all of the things that we consume in media and music, and literature as well. And yeah, you just mentioned the launch of your book, so congratulations.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Of course, we will link the book in the description of the show, but I wanted to read the description. It says, this book provides a sociological examination of gender issues concerning the evolving place and role of women in the world of heavy metal, grounded in feminist theories of gender difference and in close dialogue with relevant thematic studies from various perspectives. The study specifically analyzes how women are perceived to do gender by members of the heavy metal community, which has traditionally been largely composed of men and is commonly known for its hypermasculine qualities. So, my very first question is, what exactly are theories of gender difference?
Yeah, great question. So, basically, one of the biggest theories that kind of really spoke to me, even as an undergraduate student, was Weston Zimmerman's concept of doing gender. And basically, it's a very easy to understand concept or theory, depending on how you use it. And basically, it just advocates that gender is a performance for everyone. So even if it's happening subconsciously, you still are doing acts to let others around you know how to interpret your gender the way that you want it to be perceived. So again, through socialization, so things that we learn from parents, peer groups, the media, religion, literally anything in our external environment, we get cues about what is socially acceptable for women and what is socially acceptable for men. And the people who do their gender, again, using the words of it, do your gender. If you follow, so if your biological sex is female and you perform yourself in a feminine way, then you are rewarded by society. Same thing if you're born biologically male and then you perform yourself in a masculine way, you're rewarded by society. But if you start to go outside of those norms, that's where you could potentially have negative sanctions or punishments to an extent for breaking your gender performance. So the concept really, really struck me because it's something that, as a feminist, I myself had just never thought about, but literally, if you kind of break down and think back to your average day, what you do as soon as you wake up, the clothes that you pick out to put on your body, the way that you walk, the way that you talk. I mean, literally, we could go into any human behavior, I would personally argue, and we could see how there's some type of gender norms guiding those behaviors to an extent. And the way that a person is treated by members of society, again, do you follow the gender norms or do you break the gender norms, and how that impacts you in the way that you're treated? And so I thought about that, within the heavy metal subculture, because of the fact that, first of all, I didn't know when I first started, especially, I didn't know a lot of other women that were heavy metal fans. Honestly, other than my mom, I back in my 20s, I didn't know other metal fans that were women. And so I just kind of knew how me and my mom were, how we acted at concerts, and how that compared to how my other guy friends acted at concerts. And that's really what got me thinking about it. So I think that concept was the biggest influence. And we talk a lot, there's a whole chapter in the book actually that goes really in depth with the idea of doing gender. It also goes back to Judith Butler, who's, one of our first original feminist scholars within this area. And she talks about gender performativity, which is very similar. Weston Zimmerman pulled a lot from her research when they came up with the concept of doing gender. So we kind of started with that, and then we brought it more into modern day, kind of in general, broad feminist theory, and just kind of looking at, sexism. Does it exist? If it does exist, how does it exist? How is it perpetuated? And then our follow up question, that was really the master's thesis. But when we decided that we wanted to make this into a book, the question we really asked ourselves was, how has it changed? So if we go back historically and look at the genre of metal and look at this idea of doing gender within the subculture of metal, has it changed? If it has changed, how has it changed? Is it getting better for women? Is it getting worse for women? And kind of what does that look like? And that's really where we, kind of dug our heels in and got started on turning this into the book that it is today.
You said that people, when they want to be seen as women, act in a specific way. Is there a way that women in metal act specifically when they want to be recognized as women?
So that was the big question that I wanted to answer with my interviews, basically. So very, very great question there. So I don't know, like, if you want me to immediately start talking about, some of the findings that are in the book, but basically, kind of in a nutshell, this is what I would say. I found that you could kind of group women metal fans into either performing masculinely or performing femininely. Now, I don't want that to be a blanket statement and say that there were not women, obviously, that would, it's a spectrum. So if we had hyper feminine on one end and hyper masculine on the other end, all fans, men, women, non gender binary, they're all sprinkled on that continuum, right? But, for the most part, not official blanket statement, but I feel like you could kind of group women more to the feminine side or more to the masculine side. And initially, early on, what I found is that if you were a woman performing more on the masculine side, you were more accepted into the subculture than if you were performing yourself on the feminine side.
Is it, I could describe myself as one of the boys?
That's a great phrase. Absolutely. Yeah. Just one of
Okay.
the guys. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what it felt to me and how I acted for a very long time. And I was more accepted than other women who behaved very feminine. I experienced that myself too, yeah.
Same. I think also there was this kind of, it made me like feel special to be like different, to listen to a different kind of music, to hang out with the dudes in my band and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I realized, I later realized how sexist that in itself is as well, to like for so long have thought of myself like the more fun kind of girl or woman, because we have this stereotype that women are, like a bitchy or nagging or all of that shit. And so if you're the cool girl and you hang out with the guys and burp along them or stuff like that, it's like, and
Absolutely.
yeah, but then also to realize that first of all there's a lot of us, and second of all, it doesn't make me better than anybody else, and also that it's actually a very widespread behavior as well. We see that in politics a lot. We see powerful women like Angela Merkel, for example, dressed very masculine, and people point that out. And also all of these business coaches telling you that you shouldn't be emotional at work so that you will be promoted and stuff like that. And that is just so wrong. But yeah, it's all of these examples that we see in the world and in our lives that we're sometimes not very aware of. And again, it's just really good to be conscious about that so that we can change it as well. What you were just saying as well about women performing more masculine and such made me think about how few women in the past, and that number is growing very fast nowadays. How few women used to do harsh vocals in,
Yes.
the 80s and 90s, and now how women who do harsh vocals also present themselves with more feminine outfits. We have Courtney LaPlante, for example, is a great example of an amazing vocalist who just, wears pastel oversized sweaters, and I love that so much. Yeah, and she's still a metalhead, and she is still a woman, and nothing will
Absolutely.
ever change that. And she just has this amazing, powerful, harsh vocals, and just this great skill and talent. We were talking about this a few months ago, Pia, I think, about also how the lens on women in metal is more critical as well, and how women
Yeah.
usually not make themselves, but usually women have to be better at their craft to be taken
Mm-hmm.
seriously,
Yeah.
and how this has evolved, because we also noticed all of these young female vocalists wanting to do everything. We followed the whole symphonic metal with the operatic female singers for a long while, and then all of a sudden there are all of these genius vocalists who can do all types of vocals. And I was wondering at some point if that is the new kind of like requisite. In order to be a woman in metal who's taken seriously, you have to do so much and be so incredible. And how do you see that, both of you?
My statement that you're referring to, I think, is that I said there are no average women in metal bands. When you are a woman in a metal band, you have to be really, really good. So, yeah, you only have a chance when you're so much better than every man who could go for the job.
Yeah, so that actually fits in perfectly with one of our themes or one of our findings that we had. And to be honest, so my co-author, Dr. Matthew DeFlem, he would be the one that could really talk to you about what's actually happening within bands, and he has the breadth of knowledge of that. And I'm going to answer the question more about the fan base, but I think that it will speak to also what's happening in bands as well. So one of the findings that we had was that women, when you ask them kind of what does it mean to be a metal fan, broadly question, or what do you have to do to be a metal fan or to be accepted as a metal fan, our women respondents would come forth and they would have this long list. You have to know the classics, you have to know the albums, you have to buy the merchandise, you need to wear the t-shirts to the concerts. I mean, they would go on, for that one question, like for 5 minutes, which doesn't sound like a long time, but in an interview it was.
It is. Mhm.
And then you ask the men, what do you have to do? Oh, just show up to a show, listen to it on the radio. And
Mhm.
that 2 second answer. And so I was really struck by that. Why is it? And so right then and there, immediately we saw a finding emerge where women feel a need to prove themselves in a way that men don't even consider or think about. And what's also interesting with this, you mentioned earlier that you're interested in kind of intersectional feminism. And so I feel like this is a really good place to bring this up. When I asked that question, I had two men in the study who were very open about their different identities from your traditional metal fan. So one of them was very open, like he talked about being a gay man in the metal scene and being very openly gay in the metal scene. And he also had a list of things he had to do to prove himself. And then another male participant was Korean, and he also said a very similar answer to what the women said about proving himself. And at one point in his interview, he actually said to me, you're asking a lot of questions about how it is to be a woman. He's like, you should try asking what it's like to be a minority in the heavy metal scene. And I, at that moment, regretted that I had not thought about that, going into the interview process. And so that's something that if, I don't know what's to come in the future, but if me and Dr. Matthew DeFlem, did something further, I think that that would be a great starting point, is to focus on other identities that are, marginalized within the heavy metal subculture. But I think it speaks volumes that all women kind of had this set list of things that you had to do to be accepted. And for men, it was just like, it was almost like, why even ask such a trivial question? Like, yeah, go to a show. That's it. No big deal. So I think that that kind of gets at what you asked, hopefully.
Yes.
That's totally the thing. Have been these memes on Instagram for a while with when you see a woman or a girl wearing a metal shirt, then there is always a guy asking, name three songs of the
Yes.
band. Or how's the cousin of the mother of the bassist called, or
Yeah.
whatever.
3 songs and all the previous lineups and all of the
Yes.
scandals. Yeah.
Yeah, but what you said after that, with the minorities, that's something we talked about in our intersectional feminism episode, because yeah, we thought about sexism or being a woman in the metal scene for such a long time, and there are also, on the other hand, skin colors missing on stage.
Absolutely.
That's a very good point, that not only women are a minority, but it's a very white dominated scene as well.
That is true. And it is just so sad because diversity brings so much diversity in terms of creativity as well. So all the different cultures um, that can influence metal and make it so much better, in my opinion. So yes, we, or I at least, look forward to a future of metal that is even more diverse and amazing. Talking about cultures and subcultures, in the excerpt of your book, there is also a mention of a culture of heavy metal feminism. How do you imagine that? What would that entail?
So I think that that definitely gets at the last chapter of the book, and we talk about that as are we moving towards a heavy metal feminism essentially? And again, this would have been the area where definitely if Dr. Matthew Deflin was here, he would be able to give a much better answer than I would, because that was definitely where he came in and did that big piece of that research. But I think that there's lots of different ways that we could talk about that. So the first thing that I've done a few interviews talking about this, and this is kind of not a great answer, but this is what I've been saying. So I'll say it again, and y'all can tell me what you think about it. But I think the first thing is that I have found from talking to other women metal fans, that for some of them, when you drop the F word, feminism, they are so used to hearing that in a political context and assuming that it has a political agenda, that they're not comfortable saying they're a heavy metal feminist for that reason. And so I think that we have to kind of think about that word and the symbolism behind it and be careful with the rhetoric that we use, because I don't ever want to put words into participants' mouths, obviously. But I think that when we think about going towards heavy metal feminism, there are absolutely hardcore feminists, myself, I would include myself absolutely in that, who are big metal fans, and we want to see the political feminism in there. Like we would love to see that, right? But I also think we have to acknowledge that when we think more broadly and think about feminism as just support for women, and non gender binary people within the subculture, it means that we have to understand that we may not be using that as a political term in that sense. So for me, when I think of feminism or heavy metal going towards feminism, I would love to see it go in that political direction personally, but I think that it's more useful to us as scholars to look at it just as, what can we do to see more women, support women? Specifically, we need to see more women in bands doing, instruments, vocals, whatever that may be, and regardless of their political identity or political affiliations. And I found that when I talked to, some of my women participants who did identify as being more politically conservative, they were much more comfortable once I explained it that way and said, when I say feminism, I mean it in this context, not necessarily the political context that we see in kind of mainstream society when you hear the word. Um, so I think that first, being broad with that definition, that opens up the door to support all women, in general. And I think also it's important with feminism to include, that means non-gender binary people as well, of course. And then eventually, as we progress as a subculture, then maybe we can get even more into that political feminism that I would personally love to see. And it's not that it's not out there, I just don't think it's in the mainstream metal the same way that other things are, if that makes sense.
It's something that I have been thinking about for a while as well. And I was talking to a colleague yesterday, actually, a feminist colleague. I'm working in a feminist organization here right now. It's an organization that is very pro-choice, and right now Ecuador is actually the parliament is actually debating a law about abortion, and so it is like everything, it's work, so it's all in my mind right now. And I was thinking, I was talking to my colleague yesterday, and she said her like social media bubble consists mostly of activists, political activists. She doesn't really know any non-activist influencers because we were talking about social media strategy. Anyway, what I said to her then was, for a few years now, I've been actually also thinking, as part of my feminist work, internal work, so to speak, about what you were just saying, how to talk to people who are not that politically engaged and that are totally scared off when I mention the word feminism. And I was thinking also, if the goal is to, and again, these are very binary words, but if I want sexist people, I was gonna say men. Okay, I rethought that. If I want people with sexist behaviors to stop those sexist behaviors, I have to talk to them, and I don't want them to close their mind's door on me the moment I say I'm a feminist, or let's talk about feminism or about women's rights, because in their heads it's like, that doesn't concern me, bye, and it's closed, and they just don't listen to you anymore. But obviously, like, leaving out the word feminism is also very unfair to all of the work that feminists have made for decades and centuries, probably. So I would never stop calling myself feminist. So it is, I think, a very, very difficult bridge to build. I think for me, it has been a challenge as well to want to do that, or to recognize my own prejudice against people who make super sexist statements, and for me to keep my mental doors open and try to establish some kind of conversation to maybe build that bridge with this person, and not just stand up and go away, which is something that I used to do because I have no patience. Yeah, so I find it very interesting. So my next question would also be, before we go further with the details about the book, do you have any more ideas? Do you have any suggestions on how to kind of do this work in the context of heavy music? And so that was the one. How can we, quote unquote, promote feminism in the context of
Mhm.
heavy music? And I'm also curious, but maybe we can touch on this about later, about your personal feminism, because I have also come to learn that we all have a very personal, individual, and different concept of how we do feminism, how we practice it, how we live it for ourselves. So, what does your feminism entail? Would also be interesting for me to hear.
Yeah, sure. So I completely find myself in the same situation you're in. There is that internal struggle between not wanting to diminish anything that has been done historically for feminist activism or research in general, but also understanding, if you're going to try to reach those people who actually still have sexist ideologies, how do we get to them without having them put the hand up and say, no, I don't want to talk to you because you've identified yourself as a feminist? And unfortunately, I don't think we have an answer for how to do that. I think that it's something that we're probably going to always struggle with internally. I hope that it gets better, as the years go by, and we don't have to have that internal struggle over that. But for me personally, and I like that you mentioned specifically the idea of kind of, academic feminism versus like your actual personal views. And so the one thing that I've tried to do, and this is not specific to metal, this is actually in my teaching. So I do teach introductory sociology. And so kind of that whole course is built around the idea of, obviously understanding what sociology is. But I personally teach that class to have students come away with an understanding of what causes racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, all of those things, and to understand what they can try to do to make it better. Now, I feel like, and I've done this before, if I go in on the first day of class and introduce myself and be like, I'm this hardcore feminist, you can see the faces of some students immediately just, some of them will literally roll their eyes. And so I immediately, after doing that one time, I was like, okay, this is not the way to approach the class. And so I stopped doing that on the first day of class. I do identify myself as a gender scholar and say that I do a lot of research on sexism, but I don't drop the F word of feminism, on the first day. And so one of the things that I do is I actually have, it's a PowerPoint slide. And I should say, most of my classes for introductory students, I haven't, the smallest class I would teach is usually 120 students at a time. And that can go all the way up to, close to 600 students in an online class. I have a lot of students. And also, most of them are not sociology majors. I may have one or two sociology majors. The rest of them are from other majors around the college, and they're taking the class because it fulfills a requirement for humanities. So a lot of them don't even want to be in the class in the first place. I think it's just something they're being forced to do, and so they're already a little bit annoyed, so to speak, with the class before it even begins. But when I get to gender and feminism theory specifically, I have a slide and I just say, how many of you raise your hand if you think that we should have equality politically, socially, and economically between all sexes? Raise your hand. And there have been one or two maybe that didn't raise their hand, but pretty much every hand goes up right away, no issues. And then I go to the next slide immediately and I show them the text on that slide, that's the official definition of a feminist. And feminism is, promoting equality among economic, social, and political power among the sexes. And so I say, this term has a rhetoric and symbolism in the past. And, in the class, we go into like symbolic interactionism and we talk about how terms can have all of these things and labels attached to them and how it can change culturally over time. And so I basically just say, if you'll just forget everything else preconceived before you came into this class and what you thought about feminism, just look at the basic definition. And I think that it's something that all of us agree on in our current society. And I don't think it works for every student, but I definitely think that that's one of the moments in the semester where I kind of see some eyes light up and they're kind of like, you know what, I kind of get this now. And I've even had students in their final evaluations, at the very end of the course, they're completely anonymous, but they can kind of give their honest feedback and opinions on the class. I have probably had over 40 students say, and again, I teach a lot of students, but still over 40 students who say, I now comfortably identify as a feminist. And to me, that's a huge, like, that makes me feel like I've done my feminist work. And I think that's
Yes.
why I
Same,
like
yeah.
teaching so much. So for me, I try to incorporate it into my teaching as part of my personal philosophy, but I always try to make sure to do it in a careful way so that I'm not, turning anyone off. Now, on the flip side of that, I have some students who come in and they say, I'm a hardcore feminist already, and I wish you would have spent more time going into like detailed specific theories. And I do that in higher level classes, just not in the 101 class. But I feel like if the goal of my 101 class essentially is to open their eyes to these isms, sexism, racism, the things I mentioned before, that approach seems to have a better outcome for getting students to be aware of these things. And so I've continued to take that approach since learning that, basically.
That's so awesome, and it's so important and great that you use your position as a teacher to educate people also in this way. And it's always important to talk to people, especially about how feminism is connotated in a very bad way.
Mhm.
Because I also often talk to people, not a big crowd, but sometimes in conversations we come to that topic. And once I had a conversation with a man who told me he has two children and his wife thinks about having a third child and everything. And then later I told him that I'm a feminist, and then he was like, "Oh wow, and I told you these things about my wife, and now you might think, well, she should go back to work and everything." I was like, "No, if she wants to have three children and wants to stay at home and do all the housework and everything, it's all power to her.
Absolutely.
I want her to have a happy life and to do things because she wants to do them and not because someone tells her to do that."
Yeah, and I think that that's, especially in that 101 class, we spend a lot of time breaking those myths down. And we talk about, and I even have, I haven't used it in a few semesters, but there's an article that just explicitly talked about specifically feminists supporting stay-at-home moms. It's not that as long as they're choosing to do it, then we're fully behind them and we support them 100%. And I think that also helps students to understand that, like, a lot of them, and I don't know, y'all are much more, probably you've been around the world more than me because I've kind of just stayed in the Southeast of America my whole life. But we have really traditional gender norms here in the Southeast in the US still. And so a lot of my students that are kind of hesitant towards feminism, I don't think they've ever actually met anyone who says openly that they're a feminist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that just meeting a feminist and having them say, oh, well, actually, these are not, those are myths. None of that is actually true about the things that I think. I think just even that one act itself is huge for them because they actually meet someone who says, I identify with this label, but let me tell you the truth about why I identify as this label. And it has nothing to do with the things, that the media or other places in society have told you.
Yeah.
That builds a bridge to my question about your book, but maybe Kiki has another question.
No, I was just yeah, just about to celebrate all of what you said. My personal feminism is very much all about the power of decision, and that goes from deciding to what career path you follow, to what you do with your body, and etc., etc. That is obviously something very political, but it's also really important to realize that politics, especially this specific part of it, they just seep through our lives, and we have to take a stand. There's just no way around it.
Absolutely.
I was just thinking, or it just popped up in my mind that many people think that feminists hate men, which is total bullshit.
Absolutely. Oh, that's one of the worst myths out there, right?
Yeah. And in your book, there is one chapter that's called Hypermasculinity and Heavy Metal. And I'm curious if the people you were interviewing, or especially the men, were aware of that, especially bands like Manowar or this very traditional heavy metal style is built on this masculinity. And yeah, what their thoughts on this word actually were.
So I think specifically speaking for the men participants that I had during those interviews, I think that most of them, when I would say the word hypermasculine, they didn't have a problem with that term. They understood that, like, they go to shows, they see the ratio of the genders at shows, and so I didn't really get a pushback when I would use that term with them. But they were quick to tell me that you didn't need to be a super masculine man to enjoy metal. And so I don't know why, but one of the most common examples, and I was really surprised by this. I'm curious if y'all have heard other people do this too. One of the common things they would say is, you don't have to look or dress or act a certain way to be a metal fan. I've seen guys show up in a suit and tie after work and rock out harder than the guys in the, covered in tattoos with piercings. And for some reason, that example of the man in the suit and tie coming from work, multiple participants use that. And I had never really thought of that as an example, but I thought it was interesting because I feel like that example also gets at socioeconomic status. So talking about the fact that it's not, poor men necessarily, it's someone who would have a job that they're coming from in this nice suit and tie and they're going to a metal show. So I thought that that was interesting. But then also kind of on the flip side of that too, a lot of them said that they did not feel that there was a need for men or women to act hypermasculine. But when you talk to the women themselves, they kind of have a different story about that. And one of the biggest questions that we had going into the project, um, and specifically, this had actually, you mentioned earlier, research in like political areas about women who perform themselves feminine or masculine. The literature review that we did for this, we looked at all kinds of groups, politics, leisure activities, any research that had been done in kind of a male dominated or hyper masculine group. I looked, in the literature review trying to figure out what was the pattern. So no matter what kind of a group it is, did we see a pattern just based on gender differences and this idea of a masculine performing woman versus a feminine performing woman? And what I found was that if you perform yourself masculinely in pretty much any masculine group, you're rewarded more than if you're a woman who performs in a feminine way. And so I connected that back to the act of flashing at a concert versus the act of moshing. And so I was curious before I even went into the interviews, what were participants going to say about women who flash and what were participants going to say about women who mosh? And so what I found is that for men and women, there did seem to be a hierarchy that formed. So if you were a woman who got in a mosh pit, you kind of had the top tier respect. You were like the phrase, being like one of the boys, being like one of the guys. And then as you get lower down and you start to seep more into the femininity, And I would even specifically say the sexualization of femininity. Obviously, that's where flashing would come in. So some of my participants flat out said, I've been a metal fan for 30 years and I've never seen a woman flash at a show. And that surprised me because I've seen flashing a lot at different subgenres of metal for sure. And so I had to kind of reflect on that, and I talked through it with Matthew, the co-author of the book. And like I said, he's been to more shows than anybody I've ever met, and across all genres of music, not even just metal, but all genres in general. And we started talking about it, and I realized, I've only been to metal shows in the Southeast. And so I think that traditional gender identity that comes in the Southeast, being in the Bible Belt, I think that may be why I see more flashing at concerts, is because the idea that this is a feminine behavior you can perform that also is supposed to show your solidarity with the band and show your dedication to the band. But what was clear was that, and I have to say, I did not have any women in my specific group that said they would ever flash. And the women themselves were quick to distance. They would make fun of those women. They would call them groupies. They would say that they didn't have a place in metal. They were very quick to be like, I don't flash and I don't associate with women who do that. And so they were very, and we actually call that defensive othering in sociology. So the idea that you are defensively saying, I am not like that type, whatever the identity may be. Whereas when you ask the men about it, they would chuckle and laugh and say, I've got no problem if a woman flashes. There was like one guy that was like, I love it when women flash. I think it's the greatest thing. But most of them were more like, her body, her choice, whatever she wants to do. And that sounds very feminist, right? To be like, if she wants to flash, that's cool. And the women, again, they were more defensive othering in the process of it. But men also, though, were quick to point out that they did have more respect. They didn't come out and say, like, I have more respect for a woman who flashes, but the nuance was there that if you moshed, you were to be treated higher and considered a better metal fan, I would even say, than if you were doing feminine stuff. One of my favorite quotes, if not my favorite quote from all the interviews that we did, was one guy said that he knew that we were moving towards feminism in metal when he started to see women at shows who were no longer the holder of things for their partners who were going to mosh. So standing at the back of the bar, holding your significant other's stuff while they go and have a good time at the metal show. He said instead they've got their purses, they've got all their own stuff in their purse, and they're doing the same stuff that their partners are doing at the shows. And I loved that. I thought that was really great.
That's also my experience because when I was younger, I was wearing these army trousers and boots and everything, and I was in the mosh pits. And I can also say that they are the most kind people in the mosh pit because when you fall down, everybody helps you to stand up and stuff
Absolutely.
like that. Because earlier you were saying that prejudice against metal, that it's so brutal and everything, but a mosh pit is a really good place to be in. But yeah, I think I had this high reputation, so to speak. And I was also later involved in when groups of men were talking about other women who were dressed very feminine and stuff like that. So they involved me in the conversation of, what do you think this woman looks like, or is she sexy? Who looks better and stuff like that. So I was really involved in this locker room talk.
Yes, that's a great way to describe it. Yeah.
That was a very, I won't say funny thing, but it was interesting to experience that, and that this, what you just said, defensive othering, that's, I think that's what I did too, because I was also like, oh, I would never dress like this to go to a metal show and stuff like that. So
it's a really good term to learn, though, defensive othering. I think we all do that in some form or other. But yeah, as you just said, that is probably something that I described earlier today. Yeah, this whole, I don't know, thinking you're better because you're pointing out somebody else's differences in the end. It's just, we're all just different and unique.
And like whenever I talk about defensive othering, one of the things, like, and this is when I'm teaching or just having a casual conversation with people, is remember that as women, we're socialized to defensive other. We're from a very young age taught by the media, all of the other external forces, that we should defensive other. And that's just a way of women hurting other women. But the reason, and I did it myself, of course, we're trained to do it in our societies. And so it's a really tricky thing to navigate. And I don't think anyone can ever be perfect at it. And when I was younger, I was the same. I remember being in like middle school and high school, and would just, like if I saw anything super girly related to metal, I would go out of my way to be like, oh, that's, posers and they're weaker and like that kind of stuff. And they're just, there's just not a place for it. But what's also interesting, this is just purely 100% from personal experience. When I first started going to concerts, and I was old enough to like get in mosh pits and things like that, I've always been someone that loved makeup and fashion. So I wear a ton of makeup, even like to work. Like I'll have eyeshadow and lashes and the lipstick and everything. And so in my mind, I viewed myself as a very masculine metal fan from my behaviors, but my physical appearance was the complete opposite direction. Very, very feminine, like a lot of, big hair, makeup, all that stuff. And so I remember the first time I tried to get in a mosh pit, no one would like push me back. And I finally just like in between songs, I was like, why can't I, like, what am I doing wrong? And this guy was like, "You're too feminine to be in this." And the fact that he said too feminine just was like a light went off in my head. And so after that, I remember going to a show purposefully not wearing makeup. I think I wore black lipstick and that was it. And then I tried again and it worked. And it was like the greatest feeling because I was finally in a mosh pit. But then I was kind of sad when I got home that night and I was like, man, I didn't get to wear my cool outfit and cool crazy makeup to the show that I was, excited to do. And so I tried to figure out how do you like what to do with myself as a metal fan who was trying to be feminine in my outward appearance, but kind of had more masculine behaviors. And it's something I still wrestle with today. And, that was 10 years ago. So I think that that's one thing that I like to talk about too with this is like, I feel like we shouldn't be forced to put ourselves into boxes as women and say either I am the masculine woman metal fan or I am the feminine woman metal fan. Like we can be all kinds of mixes of masculine and feminine at the same time. So I don't know if y'all have ever experienced anything like that, but it was a really profound experience for me as a metal fan to kind of have that happen.
Hell
Yeah.
yeah, and to be aware of that too. I mean, we all
Yeah.
probably have tons of these kind of anecdotes, but I also
Hmm.
remember like people being surprised and shocked and looking at me when I approach a mosh pit, and I don't go fully in anymore, but just like
I don't
staying,
either.
just like staying in the margins with these super huge guys wanting to like protect you and putting their arm in front of you, and it's like, thanks, but I'm okay, dude. Yeah, or when I brought my husband over to Wacken and we met a group of guys and they were like, "Oh, she's the metalhead and you're the guest," so to speak. All right.
I
Yeah,
definitely, yes. I had that happen myself. So there have been guys I have dated in the past that I would take to a metal show, and they're, definitely performing. They're not metal fans. Like maybe they know a little bit of they know a few songs that they hear on the radio or something, but they're, puffed out. Don't worry, like I'm gonna take care of you. And I'm like, sweetheart, I'll take care of you. You just stand in the back and like I'll handle myself at the metal show.
Yeah.
And then
oh
even
yeah.
like my baby brother, like he's my little baby brother, which he's not that young. He's like, I think he just turned 30 or 29, so he's not a baby, but he likes metal. He just doesn't go to a lot of shows. And so the first time I took him to a show, he super went into like protective of my sister mode. And then he ended up getting stuck, and I had to kind of like wiggle him out of being on the outskirts of the mosh pit. And I was like, you just go stand in the back. And then he recorded a video of me moshing and was like, I just can't believe that you actually did that. He's like, you would talk about it, but I didn't actually think you did it. And it just like blew his mind that, that would happen. But yeah, so I've had that experience more times than I can count. I imagine any woman who moshes has had that experience.
Totally. And I mean, that is something that is, or that shows these differences in biology, right? Like body mass and sizes and everything,
Mhm.
in which we don't really have that much influence to make it equal, so to speak. So I was honestly a bit scared when I read the whole theories of gender difference that it would go into that direction. Because there are obviously biological differences that we just cannot abolish, but that should never be an argument about how about differences in rights and
Mhm.
autonomy and equality. So
Absolutely.
yeah, that is, I think, also kind of a a bit of a difficult discussion for me sometimes still to find the right arguments with people who bring that up. But yeah, I think Pia wanted to say something as well.
Was the so-called male gaze also part of your research?
So I myself did not, during the master's thesis, go into the male gaze. Obviously, I'm familiar with the term and I've used it in other things that I've done. I don't think I mentioned, but kind of like my main area of research interest is popular culture. So the male gaze is very important to that. Um, the one thing that I do talk about and I like to bring up though is this. So the fact that Revolver magazine had, I don't know if they still do it, I need to check, but I think it was the top 10 hottest chicks in metal, and that would be the like if I had a subscription for the year, that would be the magazine where I could get the most information about women in metal bands. But I hated that it was under the guise of who was the hottest and let's rank them 10, 9, 8, so on and so forth down. And I think that that definitely gets at the male gaze. So the idea that this prominent metal magazine, they may mention, and I do think it's gotten better since, this was, I don't even know, this would have been probably back in like 2013, 14, 15, around that time period. So I think it's gotten better. I no longer have a subscription to the magazine anymore, so I can't say for sure. But the fact that if we wanted, as readers of these magazines to get information on lots of women at one time in one magazine, it had to be from that Hottest Chicks in Metal magazine. And I felt like too that also that left women who, were not performing themselves in a feminine way in the band, they weren't in the issues. So I think that that's definitely something to consider, and definitely problematic. I do think one thing and I'm also curious what both of you think about this too. So we talked earlier about women who maybe are now like having that really deep growl and they're being, very masculine in their vocals, but then they dress very sexy. And for me, the epitome of that is like Carla Harvey or Heidi from Butcher Babies, which they're not as popular as some, the other bands that have women in them. But I feel like they've almost, and going to their shows too, I feel like they found a way to kind of almost take the, like weaponize their sexuality, weaponize the male gaze, and kind of throw it back at mainstream society, and even to an extent the metal subculture itself, for those in the culture that still remain, sexist and, have the male gaze, so to speak. And I think that there's something really powerful about that for all women, even women who don't want to dress, sexy and things like that at metal shows. But I feel like that they've done it in a way that brings power. And any women bringing power in the subculture to me is good for all women. So I think that that's a neat thing that's kind of transpired over the last, decade or so.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's very important that in Butcher Babies there are two singers,
Yes.
because that's very empowering that they are there on stage together, both dressed very sexy and both very badass at the vocals. They show with this that there can be more than one woman, because if you look at everything else, if you look at the Smurfs, I think these little blue
Hmm.
people, children stuff, there is one woman. If you look at any a bit older superhero team, there's always one woman. And in a lot of bands, there is also only one woman. And in Butcher Babies, they show, yeah, we can empower each other. And also, none of us has to be the most beautiful woman or the sexiest one, because we're here together on stage and we're just having a good time. And that's so awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think that is such a good point to like general society, like the token woman in pop culture that we see all over the place, and kind of the message that that sends. I always think about young girls, but even, women of any age that, again, it's subconscious. We don't explicitly stop. And for most people, they don't stop and say, gee, I wonder why there's only one superhero that's a woman in that group. But they still internalize the message subconsciously, even if they're not actively reflecting on it. And so I think you hit a really strong point there for the metal community as well as just, mainstream society in general.
Yes, and that message usually is exactly that there is only place for one woman in this boys' club, and you have to kind of fight for that position with other women who could actually be your teammates, your collaborators, and just empower and support each other. And just recognize that it's actually this competition is actually just a construct. Somebody invented it at some point and they have triggered it onto us, and we have sadly believed it and put other women down, and that is not what we should be doing. in the
It's so
future.
much easier for the patriarchy if we fight each other.
Exactly.
Yeah,
If we fight each other,
exactly.
they don't have to do anything.
Right.
Yes, but
Right.
also what you were mentioning, both of you, about the male gaze and objectification and the sexualization of women is, I think, also a very delicate topic, because on the one hand, obviously, it's great to be the person in power over the objectification and or sexualization of your own body. And yes, more power to you if you want to use that for your advantage. That's just amazing if that is your decision. Obviously, we've heard over the years other kind of stories about the music industry, and we have also heard firsthand from women in metal who just don't want that and don't want to participate in that, and that is also a very valid choice. So, and also, this whole thing leads to other more dangerous sides of discrimination, violence against women and all of that, which we don't, fortunately, we don't hear too much in the context of heavy metal music, I think. Um, but it's always something to have an eye out for. And because we are, and we talked about this last year in the summer, because we are so, or not yet too many women in the context of heavy metal concerts and festivals, etc., we should be a bit more protective of each other, maybe, or we already are, and that is something that shouldn't be necessary. But we have developed a lot of coping mechanisms to just go through life being a metalhead and living it. And there was something else that I also forgot now, but anyway.
I can pick up the word metalhead until you found your thought, because that's also a chapter in your book, Metalhead Music as Identity. Is there a difference between men who identify as metalhead and women? What did women say about how they identify, or did they really identify as metalhead?
That's a great question. So I can't give you like obviously I did qualitative interviews with a small group of people, so I can't make like macro
Yeah, sure.
generalizations or give statistics about how many are women versus things like that. But what I did find, and I thought this was very interesting, is that that was the one thing that men and women seemed to give the same answer for, was that they were very proud to be metalheads, and so many of them used the word passion. I would say, what does it mean to be a metalhead? It's all about passion. Men and women both use that word. Almost every person used that word. And it really struck me because I feel like one unique thing about, and not to, again, I'm not trying to make a blanket statement, but I feel like most people that I've talked to in interviews or just, at shows, you view that as a crucial part of your identity in a lot of cases. Like, I don't know a lot of people who are kind of like casual metal fans. It's kind of like you're in it or you're not really in it. You know what I mean? Like kind of an us versus them mentality to an extent. So like I felt like that was one of the good things where we could see progression, towards feminism or towards more women in metal, was that both men and women were very confident and comfortable saying, yes, it's a part of my identity and it's a part of my identity that I'm proud of and I'm passionate about it. I don't know necessarily if I'm trying to remember back if there was anything in the interviews where anyone didn't want to use the term metalhead. I can't say for sure, but I don't remember anyone that had that feeling or thought.
Hmm. It's good to also talk about what men and women metalheads have in common and not only about the
Mhm.
differences.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I think there are more things we have in common than there are things that, yeah, are
Yeah.
different, basically.
Yeah.
Very true.
So, Kiki, did you find your question?
Yeah, but I don't really know if it's that relevant again. And I don't think it was a question, it was more of a comment. We were talking about the male gaze and all of this, and I remember noticing through our work with metal and high heels before we became bleeding metal, on our quest, so to speak, to make women in metal more visible, we noticed that our own audience was also very male, and this was also because the majority of the audience, especially in symphonic metal, is very male and a bit older than us. Even it was a bit conflicting for us because we actually want to encourage more women to, live their best metalhead life, and not necessarily, just to bring the news to the people who get them anyway. So that was one of the things, to see that weirdly, when seeing women on stage, not necessarily more women will be in the audience. Do you maybe have like a sense of what subgenre of metal attracts the more women, or something like that?
So I definitely think from personal experience, I think the new metal genre has still it's definitely more men than women, but I do think that there are more women in that one. Um, I you know, and y'all know this, but the funny thing too is like when I was doing these interviews, so many participants would stop me and say, "Well, what subgenre are we talking about?" Like I can't answer that in broad for heavy metal or what genre. And so, and like it gets really elitist. That word elitist came up a whole lot. That like certain genres are supposed to be better than other genres, subgenres, and this, that, and the other. So from speaking from someone who goes to a lot, specifically like the new metal shows, like I mentioned before, I see a lot of women at those compared to like some of the heavier bands maybe that I've got. Like I remember being at an In Flames concert specifically, and like I might have been the only woman there. And then, a week later I went to like a Slipknot concert, and there were, still more men, but there were a lot more women, which obviously Slipknot is a bigger band, so it was a bigger venue and there were more people there in general. But and I also think, and this, I don't know why this is, but I think obviously the more mainstream the band is, the more women you're going to see. So if you go to a Metallica concert, you're probably going to see a lot of women at a Metallica concert, just because of their popularity, compared to like the smaller bands.
It makes sense in general to know that, or to realize that in general the population is supposed to be kind of 50-50, but
Hmm.
metal is not a mainstream genre, and so I don't know, like the proportions change in that way as well. And of course, like the more indie underground bands won't necessarily have a lot of female fans because they're just not generally known. And the bigger the band, the bigger the portion of their fan base that will be female. Something like that. It's probably math. I don't know.
I will say, and this is not from research, this is personal experience. I don't know how familiar y'all are specifically with new metal, but my absolute favorite band until I die will be Korn. I'm hardcore Corn fan. And I think that after talking to other Corn fans, men and women, and even some non-gender binary Corn fans, the fact that Jonathan Davis lyrics talk a lot about sexual assault from his childhood, I see a lot of women fans who are drawn to that band for that reason. And I think that having a lyrical content about something like that in a large portion of your songs, and obviously we know sexual assault is at a much higher rate for women than men, even though of course men are absolutely still victims of sexual assault. I think that draws in women. The fact that they've got someone who is angry about something that happened to him where he was sexually assaulted and he is letting that rage out. And if you're a woman and you identify with that, that's very powerful. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that I do think that I tend to see more women fans specifically at corn shows. And I talk to people and I've seen corn over 15 times now. And I talk to people in between sets and stuff, and that gets brought up a lot. The fact that he is open about being sexually assaulted as a man, and that they respect that a lot. So I think that the lyrical content of the songs can have a pretty big impact on who you see coming within the subgenres of metal themselves. And so I would suspect if you were able to do an academic study where you really kind of dove in and looked at, like you mentioned, album covers, lyrical content, maybe even the style of dress and physical appearance of the members of the bands. And if you see some that have symbolism or narratives that may resonate with a woman audience, that's where you're going to see more women fans probably. But again, that's just kind of based on my personal experience of going to a lot of metal shows, not necessarily based on any kind of research that I've done.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
I have the table of contents of your book here right in front of me, and there are so many interesting topics in there. So I can totally recommend to all of you out there who are listening to this podcast now, get informed about the book. We have the link in our show notes so that you can you see where you can get it or get a sneak peek into the book. Because yeah, the topics are really, really interesting. Is there something that you found out in your research that was surprising for you or that impressed you?
I would think the thing that surprised me the most, and this is coming from myself being a woman who is a heavy metal head, right? I think that I was surprised that your average white cisgender man who is a fan didn't think you had to do all those things to prove yourself, because in my mind I just assumed this was something that all of us did. It was part of, we are very focused on authenticity as, being true and real metalheads, not being posers. And so I assumed that that was going to be for all of the people that I interviewed, but then to see that a lot of men were like, just go to a show, and I was like, really? Like, they think that's enough to call yourself a metalhead? If someone told me they went to one show and then they said they were a metalhead, I would be offended. Like, you're not, like, you
Mm,
haven't done anything, right?
yeah.
And so I think that seeing that there's definitely a, I don't know, misconception between what your average traditional stereotypical white metal fan thinks compared to people who have some type of a marginalized identity, and those are the ones that feel that they need to prove themselves. I think that that spoke a lot to me about, heavy metal in general, but just also kind of about like being a human in a society where, there are norms and stuff, thinking that you have to do certain things because of a part of your identity and then other people don't realize it. And I think that it speaks volumes in regards to many things, but the one that I think I would kind of focus on at this point would be, um, that they're not aware of what we go through as having a marginalized status. They don't know that we're putting in all this work, and I feel like if they don't know we're putting in that work to prove ourselves, then we're doing a lot of work and we're not getting credit for it. And how often historically and even today does that happen to women, that we put in so much work into things and we don't even get credit that we do those things? It's like, oh yeah, of course they did that. That's what
Mm.
women do. And I feel like that resonated with me a lot, personally. And then the other thing that I have said, kind of is like a big takeaway from the research, is I feel like if you ever come across a metal fan who brings up, like they don't, like, there's enough women in metal, we don't need any more, like, it's fair or whatever. I always say, remember, women metalheads are not here to take away anything from the genre. We're here to add to it. We're going to make it better. We're going to bring in new perspectives. And so, not having good representation, and not just from women, any other race, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, whatever that may look like, or different identities, they're bringing something new to the genre, and that's just going to make it better. So we're not taking away, we're adding. And I think that that's a powerful message that I hope a lot of people, when they read the book, will take away from the book.
Yeah, awesome. And there
Oh
will
yeah.
still be bands with only male members, so the
Right.
other things don't go away. You just have more to choose from.
Exactly. Exactly.
Hell yes. One of the comments that I heard once from, well, many fans of symphonic metal was that women's singing was more emotional in their ears, and that is why they are so drawn to it. So that is obviously just the start.
Yeah,
But and
absolutely.
it may not be so like, it may not apply to every female singer. It may not apply to every band, and also not every fan or listener will interpret it that way. But yeah, I totally agree. Women have these different perspectives that will and that have enriched music and heavy metal, especially, since always. And yeah, it just makes it better and better. And yes, also, yeah, let's always make, and that is one of the things that we were talking before as well. Maybe to close up the episode, how to be more feminist in the context of heavy metal if you decide to be that way, or to be an ally to women and non-binary people, trans people, people of color, etc., is to make them more visible. We have been trying to do that lately as well, so recommending bands with these people in them, and not only that, but also making the people behind the scenes, behind the stages, more visible as well. We have talked to amazing people here for the podcast, women in metal record labels, women in the administration of festivals, women in the academics of heavy metal like you, and so many more. So it's just so important to know that, first of all, women have been part of rock and then metal since its very beginning, and we maybe were just not so vigilant and didn't see them. So the more we make them visible and the more representation we get, that's what Pia and I always say, right? In order to
Absolutely.
know that we can do things, we have to see those things done by people who look like us. So
Yes.
get on those stages.
Yes.
Hey, yeah.
Yes. Is there anything else you want to say?
So I was actually going to say literally what you just said. Represent in any research I've done or any, with pop culture or anything, representation to me is absolutely the most important. We have to inspire younger generations, and they are inspired when they see accurate representation. So we really need to see everything, not just heavy metal, where we see an accurate representation and reflection of what society actually looks like, and is. And then the second thing too, I just so appreciate the fact that both of you have this podcast that you work on and you're talking about these issues, because I feel like that is one of the biggest pieces of representation, is for having places where women or any other again historically marginalized identities can come and get information and find community and find support. And I think that what you're doing is exactly the thing that's going to propel this and make us actually go closer to a feminism of heavy metal, or heavy metal feminism, whatever you want to call it.
Thank you. If people want to
Yes.
follow you, are you somewhere on social media or on Instagram?
I am on Instagram, so my hashtag is goth rose aesthetic. It is definitely more fashion and aesthetic, but you will see me in some, corn t-shirts and other heavy metal band
Yeah.
apparel.
Hell yeah. What are you listening to at the moment?
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked. So, Korn has a new song out as of this morning, and I have not listened to it. I was going to reward myself with listening to it after I got finished with talking with y'all today.
Oh, that's
But
awesome.
I'm definitely really, really into in this moment right now. Anything, just Maria Brink, Googling her, reading about her. That's definitely my current hot topic, so to speak.
Hell yeah.
Kiki, what are you listening to?
Right now, I'm listening to a lot of things, but I like the new Volumes record a lot. Band is
Hmm.
an amazing single, an amazing song in general. And you, Pia?
I'll definitely check that out.
Yes.
I'm listening to the latest album from Infected Rain that was just released in early January, I think. And I got a promo copy by a very unpopular band from Leipzig. It's called The Sleeper, and they play, I would call it progressive metalcore. And I'm gonna write a review about it. And so, yeah, that record is really good. So let's link it also in the show notes and recommend the band to our listeners.
Okay, thank you so very much, Dr. Anna, for joining us and talking to us, and yeah, making us even wiser. Not that we were wise at all before, but
Thank you so much for having me and take it. Like, this means so much to me. And again, just one more time, the work that y'all are doing is just that's fantastic.
Thank you, and right back at you. We all need
Thank you.
to, to get informed and to look at things in a more analytic way, and that is what you're doing on a higher level. So I look forward to reading your book as well. If I ever get through my book list, I should definitely read more. But I spend my time listening to podcasts, and you should also follow the Bleeding Metal podcast on Spotify and Stitcher, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this right now. And yeah, also recommend us to your friends and such. And we will be back next month, probably talking again about women's rights and things. And also, but before that, and before I forget, um, March 8th is coming and it is International Women's Day. And I just wanted to say to everybody out there who maybe doesn't know that it's not about sending flowers and telling the women in your life how awesome and beautiful they are and how they are the source of life and stupid things like that. I'm sorry, but not sorry. It's about remembering and celebrating the fight, the feminist fight that has been happening for centuries and the one that we still have to do. So, if you want to be an ally, if you want to be a feminist, why don't you just support feminist causes financially if you can? Why don't you go out and attend women's marches all over the world? Why don't you just give your female partner rest for the day and do all of the housework? And other things like that, and just know that it's a day to keep fighting for the rights that we don't have in all of the world, women all over the world don't have yet, but we're on that. So yeah, and then that is coming in March. Yes.
Yeah, awesome. That's it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks again for being guest in this podcast, and thank you all out there for listening to this episode. And yeah, hopefully you'll listen to the next episode again. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.